Welcome to the Museum of Boring Things. Here, ordinary objects rest beneath the dust of time, gently sheltered in the muted glow of forgotten meanings. Each piece is carefully catalogued. A subscription merely records your name in the guest book. Tonight's exhibit is the safety pin, shaped without flourish, born in shadow yet indispensable in daily life, a quiet relic of anonymous brilliance. Let your thoughts uncoil, your breath soften. Should sleep arrive before the story ends, consider it a quiet gift from the collection. Now let us open the glass case. It begins, as such things often do, with an itch. Not metaphorically, but truly a physical discomfort. Somewhere around the hip or the shoulder where poorly hemmed cloth once scratched against skin. Long before the thing had a name or a spring, the human need to fasten cloth to itself was already murmuring through the threads of time. The earliest human garments, stitched from sinew and softened hides, could not hold together solely on intention. And so, somewhere between invention and necessity, came the notion of the clasp. Here in the dim vitrin nestled between a rusted bronze fibula and the shy glint of a copper spiral, we trace the ancestor of the modern safety pin, not through blueprints or patents, but through the slow tactile language of ancient hands. Across Mesopotamia and Mycenae, early brooches were more adornment than utility, yet some among them whispered of function. One may imagine a shepherd drowsing against stone, gently nudging a pin through wool to still the evening breeze. The whisper of woven flax. Those earliest designs, though rudimentary, revealed the first principle of the safety pin, tension contained. Bronze pins bent slightly and arced back upon themselves like tired dancers returning to the floor. Without springs, they relied on the elasticity of metal and the patience of fingers. And so the safety pin's first lesson was one of compromise, between rigidity and return. Like a reed bending in wind or a librarian balancing on one foot to reach the top shelf. It would take centuries for this instinct to crystallize. While the Romans elaborated upon the fibula with ornate curvature and precious stones, the pin's purpose still wavered between the decorative and the accidental. Much later, in the quiet northern workshops of the medieval world, blacksmiths would hammer crude straight pins for household use, not for safety, but for urgency. These sharp, gleaming slivers secured everything from rags to ritual cloth, though often at the expense of the wearer's peace. A whisper of linen splitting. And here we pause, not in reverence, but in recognition. For the pin, any pin, represents a curious paradox. It secures by penetration. A fastening built on intrusion. A gentle violence in the service of cohesion. This contradiction lingered unresolved until one ordinary man had one ordinary idea, though not quite yet. Through the murmur of soot and factory breath, the Industrial Revolution summoned new materials. Wires became thinner, more malleable. Metal obeyed the heat with greater subtlety. And still, tailors and seamstresses gritted their teeth and drew blood from customers too impatient for buttons. The pin remained dangerously beautiful. A sliver of metal with no respect for the distracted or the drowsy. The hum of cotton drawn taut. And then came that most inevitable of events, the complaint. A man named Walter Hunt in the United States once sat restlessly twirling a length of brass wire between his fingers. Legend insists he owed a small debt and needed a fast solution. Whether it was the debt or the restless fidgeting that bore fruit is of no true consequence. What matters is this. He bent the wire into a coil, allowed it to loop back upon itself, and invented not a pin, but a promise that a sharp thing could be safe. His design was modest, a clasp to cover the point, a spring to maintain tension. Nothing new in its components, but new in combination. Much like a poem built from simple words, its power lay in restraint. The soft click of an idea coming quietly to rest. Hunt's safety pin was patented in 1849, then sold for a sum that now seems both trivial and tragic. He relinquished all rights for $400. One could argue he invented safety itself, at least in the narrow corridor between fabric and flesh, and gave it away for the price of a modest piano. Yet what followed was something far stranger than profit, replication. The safety pin multiplied not by revolution, but by quiet seepage. It appeared in women's sewing boxes, in soldiers' kits, in hospital wards and school bags. It mended skirts, secured bandages, aligned shoelaces, and occasionally stood in for buttons lost to time. A whisper of starch, a murmur of laundry. Its rise was not meteoric, but tidal. Slowly it became so familiar that it ceased to be seen. A pin was a pin. Until it failed, it remained invisible. Only when its spring wore thin or its clasp loosened did it reveal its presence through injury. A reminder that safety is often a silence, not a feature. In manufacturing, its form barely changed for over a century. Factories coiled wire with rhythmic precision, snipping and curving with mechanical grace. Some pins were silvered for weddings, others bronzed for military use. But the shape, that gentle arc, the silent hook, the coiled spring remained sacred. Like a monk repeating a prayer not because he believes, but because the silence it creates is preferable to noise. And here we encounter the safety pin's second paradox. Its perfection made it invisible. Unlike the telephone or the clock, it did not evolve publicly. There were no safety pin expos, no grand unveilings. It simply settled into drawers, disappeared into hands, and held fast until forgotten. Its quietude resembled not obsolescence, but transcendence, like a magician's assistant who never asks to be unbound. Of course, not all safety pins were made equal. Some bent prematurely, others snapped under strain. But the archetype, the tension clasp, the coiled grace endured. Even today, with plastic fasteners and automated stitches, the safety pin lurks in every emergency kit, every artist's pocket, every backstage sewing room. A whisper of tool under light. It has been reimagined as jewelry, as protest symbol, as metaphor, yet none of these deviations altered its essence. They merely pointed to what had always been true, that within its smallness lies a stubborn kind of immortality. To fasten what is loose, to soften what is sharp, to vanish once its task is done. And now, as we close the case, slowly with the hush of velvet and glass, we begin to trace the longer arc. For the safety pin, though humble, has not yet finished speaking. In its silent hinge, it still holds centuries. And somewhere between its coil and clasp, there stirs a question far greater than fastening. The safety pin did not spread like wildfire. It crept, folded inside the lining of a glove, sewn into the hem of a traveling cloak, carried across borders not by traders or generals, but by laundresses and seamsters and children. Where buttons fell, where seams tore, it lingered quietly triumphant, like a cat asleep on forbiddance fabric. Here in the museum's eastern wing, behind a slightly fogged pane of quartz, we find a pin shaped by salt air, recovered from the pocket of a sailor's oilskin jacket. Its brass dulled and softened by brine, the clasp still firm despite a century of sea mist. It had once secured a letter, folded 3 times, addressed to no one in particular. The murmur of wool brushed in haste. By the late 19th century, the safety pin had begun to shed its reputation as novelty. Factories across Europe and North America introduced them into their catalogs, often buried between more glamorous wares, pocket watches, razors, inkstands. It was rarely advertised, rarely gifted. One did not aspire to own a safety pin. One simply found oneself in need of one. The pin's utility, however, was magnetic. It migrated into childbirth kits, disaster relief trunks, soldiers' packs. In times of upheaval, its simplicity was its strength. During the Great War, nurses fastened dressings with pins they boiled nightly, the metal shimmering faintly in makeshift sterilizers. A silent glint beside bandage and gauze. Soldiers repurposed them to replace missing buttons, to close wounds crudely, to mark maps. A faint scratch of graphite under a lamplight. The industrial process behind their production remained charmingly unremarkable. Coiled wire, sheared and curved, passed through stamping machines and smoothing presses. Quality control was tactile, human. Women in aprons tested each class by feel. A good pin, they said, should close with a sigh, not a snap. A soft confirmation that order, however brief, had returned. Like the sound of a book closing after the rain, materials evolved. Steel began to replace brass. Nickel plating followed, then chromium for corrosion resistance. But the form, that hypnotic spiral in return, refused to yield. Designers tried embellishments, engraved coils, decorative knobs, but these indulgences faded. The pin insisted on its own invisibility. It wanted only to hold and then to go unnoticed. The domestic sphere, too, absorbed the safety pin into its daily rhythm. Mothers kept them tucked in sewing boxes and baby bags. A pin was a mother's fallback, her solution to missing snaps, misbehaving elastics, sudden splits in school trousers. One could trace entire childhoods in punctured cotton, a murmur of corduroy, a rustle of polyester skirts. In this museum drawer lies one such pin, slightly bent, dulled, no longer springing as it once did. Found beside a note in childish script. Don't forget gym shoes. A moment preserved not for its drama, but for its ordinariness. A relic of low-stakes chaos, salved not with shouts, but with the soft arc of a clasp. The safety pin's journey was not without oddity. In the 1930s, a brief fascination with hygiene led some manufacturers to coat pins in celluloid. It failed. The coating cracked, flaked, sometimes melted. Pins fused shut or dissolved into their fabricose. The attempt, however well-meaning, misunderstood the object's nature. The pin was not meant to be touched softly. It was meant to endure friction, sweat, haste, like a pebble mistaken for an egg. Elsewhere, the safety pin found itself in unexpected company. In hospitals, it joined thermometers, tweezers, and glass syringes and metal trays soaked nightly in antiseptic. In prisons, it became a tool of rebellion, unlocking handcuffs, concealing contraband, reshaping into tiny keys. In boarding schools, it was currency, a favor, a bribe, a secret pact sealed with a whisper and a jab. The hush of pleated skirts in a dim corridor. No committee ever declared the safety pin essential. It earned its permanence through quiet repetition, through the daily theater of loss and recovery. A pin fell and another was found. A hem came loose and it was made whole again. The safety pin was the understudy of the domestic stage, always present, never applauded. And yet, this humble tool began to gesture towards something larger, a quiet philosophy of repair. In a world increasingly driven by replacement, the safety pin lingered as a plea for restoration, a thing that did not discard but held together, however temporarily, however clumsily, like mending a metaphor with thread. One must not overlook the aesthetics of its design. The coil is not merely structural, it is symbolic. Tension gathered and held. The curved shield is not only protective, it is a gesture of care. Each safety pin in its smallest arc enacts a decision, not to pierce indiscriminately, but to fasten with awareness. There is an ethics to its shape. Here, next to a faded baby bonnet and a torn concert program, rests a pin used in the mid-20th century by a backstage seamstress at a Paris theater. Bent from use, its spring soffit once closed the bodice of an understudy who never went on stage. The play was cancelled due to rain. A tiny brass soliloquy rusted at the clasp. As factories expanded, the safety pin became truly global. It traveled by ship and train, in suitcases and cargo crates, often unmarked. One could find them in Kampala and Krakow, Delhi and Detroit, and always the same form, the same coil, the same whisper of tension and trust. They transcended borders not as symbols, but as solutions. In the 1960s, as fashion began to rebel, the safety pin found new work. No longer hidden in hems, it emerged on the outside. Punk culture reimagined it not as utility, but as defiance. Through skin, through leather, through ideology. But even there, amidst noise and posture, the form did not change. It still fastened. It still held. Like a butler who, when asked to join the riot, simply polished the silver a bit more sternly. What fascinates, ultimately, is its refusal to announce itself. The safety pin does not aspire. It remembers, it responds. In a drawer, it waits. In a pocket, it listens. In an emergency, it acts. Then, once the moment has passed, it retires quietly, the whisper of linen folded and put away. And so, as we draw the curtain on the second chamber of its tale, the pen does not close the chapter with flair. It does not insist. It merely returns to its curve, its clasp, its modest coil awaiting the next torn hem, the next loose strap, the next quietly desperate hand reaching for something, anything to hold the world together. In this chamber, we examine not the extraordinary, but the subtly persistent. From the safety pin, as it moved into the latter half of the 20th century, became less an object and more an assumption. It ceased to be introduced and began simply to be expected tucked into the lining of coats, slipped into travel kits, folded into the creases of culture itself, like a scythe sewn into fabric. By the 1970s, its global presence had matured into quiet omnipresence. Every haberdashery sold them. Every household kept a cluster pinned to cardboard or curled in a ceramic dish near the sewing machine. They came in varying sizes, though the changes were minor, longer here, slightly broader there. But the core remained unchanged, a spiral of tension and a soft shield, the faint click of steel on enamel. What distinguished this era, however, was not design but automation. Machines now assembled safety pins at speeds that blurred vision. Coils were wound, points sharpened, clasps crimped in rapid succession. A single factory in Birmingham or Guangdong could produce millions per day. And yet, even at this scale, the pin's singular grace endured, like a cathedral assembled from identical feathers. The production process, though industrial, still retained echoes of craft. Steel wire was drawn through dies to achieve the precise gauge. Machines bent it with careful angles to ensure balance. Too much tension, and the clasp would resist. Too little, and it would dangle open, helpless. There was an art to the tension, a silent grammar of pressure and release. The whisper of oil on gears. Packaging changed. Where once they'd been sold loose or in folded paper, the pins now arrived on glossy cards, punched and plastic wrapped. Branding entered cautiously tiny logos on coils, colors to indicate size, but the object itself refused vanity. It resisted becoming fashionable, though it dressed wounds, clasped dresses, accompanied midwives and morticians alike. Perhaps nowhere was this refusal more poignant than in crisis. Earthquakes, floods, wars. Safety pins traveled in 8 boxes, slipped into refugee kits, kept company with iodine and gauze. In such moments, their function was stark, to hold together what had come undone. A child's shoe, a widow's shawl, a banner in a language no longer spoken, the hush of distant voices. Here, in the West Wing drawer, rests a pin recovered from a shelter in Sarajevo. Its coil is stiff with rust. The clasp no longer closes. And yet, it carries the weight of having once worked, having once mattered. We do not ask it to glean, only to remember. And still, in the world beyond disaster, the safety pin persisted in its small duties. A bridesmaid's bustle, a choir boy's robe, the waistband of gym shorts forgotten until the bus was already turning. These were not glamorous tasks, but they were essential. For society to hold, someone must hold it, quietly, without asking. Like a librarian straightening books no one remembers borrowing. Culturally, the pen became layered. In fashion, it oscillated between invisibility and irony. Designers flirted with exaggeration, giant pins as brooches, gilded pins in place of stitching. But the heart of the object resisted performance. The more it was noticed, the less it functioned. It was not made for spectacle, but for response. In subcultures, however, it found new resonance. The punk movement, already entwined with its iconography, pushed further. Pins were not just accessories, but declarations through flesh, through politics, through contradiction. They fastened not fabric, but fury. And yet again the object remained unchanged. The same curve, the same coil. As if the world screamed around it, and it merely nodded. The safety pin also began appearing in conceptual art, in installations, in collages, in photographic stills of domesticity undone. Some artists saw in it a metaphor for fragility, others for connection. One memorable piece involved a single rusted pin suspended over a field of white thread entirely unfastened. An idea left gently ajar. There were also, of course, the fakes. Plastic imitations. Costume pins made from resin or soft alloys. They mimicked the form but lacked the purpose. Their points bent. Their springs failed. They fastened nothing. And those sold in glittering packs and pastel shades, they missed the soul of the thing, that a safety pin does not wish to be admired. It wishes to help briefly, then disappear. Like a valet vanishing behind a velvet curtain. Industrial uses also expanded. In automotive assembly lines, pins were used to temporarily align gaskets. In aerospace labs, technicians used sterilized variants to mark safety steps in prototypes. Even in medical research, micropins modeled tension forces in tissue simulations. The object had moved from bedrooms to orbit, and yet it had not grown louder. Back in the museum's restoration chamber, we maintain a modest archive of misused pins, then beyond use, twisted into spirals by children, stuck irreversibly in denim. These are not failures, they are episodes. Each speaks not of error but of overconfidence. One pin once tried to hold together a broken satchel during a rainstorm in Lisbon. It failed, but the attempt was honest. The safety pin has no illusions of permanence. Its work is by nature provisional. It asks not to last forever, but to suffice until something better arrives. This humility embedded in wire and clasp is its quiet genius. Like a ghost who tucks in the blanket before dawn, some variations emerged. Double coil pins for added tension, curved body pins for nappies, pins with colored heads for sorting. Each slight alteration whispered of adaptation, but never ambition. There was no revolution in its lineage, only response in return. Even now, in the algorithmic hush of online shops, the safety pin endures. It is rarely featured, almost never reviewed. It ships in bulk. It arrives quietly. It does not ask questions, only answers them one clasp at a time. A whisper of cardboard sliding across a countertop. In the next hall, we shall trace how this modest clasp became a global archetype not through innovation, but through gentle insistence. But for now, we linger here before a case of 1980s pins, still clipped to their original card, faded, unpurchased, still waiting, still ready. To understand the resilience of the safety pin, one must look not at the object itself, but at the environments it quietly shaped. Not headlines or revolutions, but the softer domains, bedrooms, classrooms, refugee camps, fitting rooms. The backstage of the world. And it is here, in this faint peripheral hum, that the safety pin completed its transformation from tool to texture. Like the quiet stitching in the lining of an overcoat no one remembers buying. In post-industrial society, the pin became background ubiquitous and unnoticed. The sign of a well-prepared purse, a sensible first aid kit, a grandmother's handbag arranged with quiet severity. Its frequency bred familiarity. And familiarity, in turn, bred blindness. One ceased to look for it and instead assumed its presence. The soft assumption of a button replaced without comment. We find in the northern wing a small tin from 1991. Inside, 27 safety pins of varying age and oxidation. Some sharp, others dulled. They had lived in a drawer beside batteries and string, cough drops, and expired vouchers. The tin belonged to a school custodian who, for 31 years, carried a single pin on the underside of his lapel, just in case. He never used it, but he never removed it either. A whisper of wool brushing against wool. Elsewhere, the pin played confidant to countless private panics. A sudden tear in the hem before a job interview. A bra strap misbehaving at a funeral. A rip in the seam discovered 2 minutes before stepping on stage. In each of these, the pin entered not as savior, but as companion. It never solved the problem. It simply made the problem less visible. And yet, even in its silence, the safety pin listened. It learned the shape of fear. The urgency of late trains, of missed buses, of bathroom mirrors offering no solution. It became a talisman not against disaster, but against being unfastened at the wrong moment. A defense not against catastrophe, but against exposure. This perhaps explains why the safety pin began to acquire symbolic weight in unexpected places. In moments of protest and solidarity, the pin reappeared no longer beneath fabric, but above it. In 2016, in the aftermath of political fractures and rising intolerance, people in parts of the Western world began wearing safety pins visibly. The gesture was modest, perhaps naive, a symbol of safety, of quiet allyship. "You are safe with me," it whispered, a protest not in shout but in clasp. Critics questioned its effectiveness. Could a pin protect anyone? Was it performance or purpose? But again, the pin made no claim. It did what it had always done, fasten loosely, briefly, until something stronger could be arranged. Like a temporary bridge over rising water, built not to last, but to allow passage. The soft groan of fabric under tension. In the realm of design, the safety pin continued to resist alteration. Patent filings appeared retractable tips, spring-assisted clasps, integrated threads. Few found purchase. Most were forgotten. For all our ingenuity, we returned to the same spiral. The same tension. The same shape sketched centuries ago in bronze and guesswork. The safety pin, it seemed, had already arrived. Here in the archival case, we preserve a manufacturing tool from the early 2000s. A die used to bend pins into their final form. It is modest, unmarked. It shaped millions, perhaps more. Each pin nearly identical, each clasp calibrated. It is a monument not to invention, but to repetition. Like a bell that rings only when no one listens. In domestic life, the pin retreated to the margins. Sewing kits grew smaller. Fast fashion demanded less repair, more replacement. Disposable culture threatened the pin's raison d'etre. Why mend a hem when trousers are cheaper than thread? Why carry a pin when a new pair waits in a warehouse? And yet, the pin survived. Not because it evolved, but because it hid. It curled into diaper bags, into church collection boxes, into theater prop drawers. It embedded itself in ritual and improvisation. A clasp for the robe in baptism. A fix for the torn veil at a last-minute wedding. A pin found on the floor just before the lights dim. Even its failures became stories. A pin that sprang open during a speech. A clasp that came loose during a school photo. These moments, too, were part of the pin's mythology. It did not promise perfection, only presence, a tool that said, "I'll do what I can." Like a sleepy doorman holding the gate with one hand and a sandwich in the other. Curiously, the safety pin also found life in digital culture, emojis, memes. It became iconographic shorthand for mending, for holding together what ought to break. Artists placed it in digital collages, looped GIFs, absurd surrealist edits. A pin through the moon. A pin holding the sky to the earth. Again, it made no comment. It simply fastened. One pin, made in 2022, rests now in this museum. It's still cool, its coil still unbent. It has never been used. Never fastened anything. It is, in a way, potential made solid. A clasp without a task. The whisper of intent unspoken. As we close the drawer on this era, we do not bid the safety pin farewell. We merely blink and notice that it remains. Somewhere it waits. In the glove compartment, in the drawer by the sink, in the lining of a travel bag last used 6 years ago. It waits not for admiration, but for necessity. In the next hall, we shall watch it wander further across disciplines, across metaphors. But tonight, let us pause with what is tactile, simple, and slightly curved. A thing that never asked to be noticed, and yet has held together more of the world than we will ever quite admit. As we drift further into the corridor of small certainties, the safety pin begins to take on a peculiar kind of gravity, not from mass or size, but from repetition. Its existence, reiterated across centuries, forms a kind of rhythm: bend, clasp, release, forget, again and again and again. like the faint ticking of a clock hidden beneath blankets. By the early 21st century, the safety pin had become invisible not through absence, but through overpresence. It was not noticed because it was never not there. This, of course, is a dangerous form of existence. Objects that become background risk erasure. And yet the pin remained not bold, not defiant, but persistent. Like a single hair resting on a woolen coat, unmoving and unimportant until one finally notices it has always been there. In this section of the museum, we present a series of everyday sightings photographs, receipts, fragments of lives in which the safety pin featured briefly but usefully. A concert ticket folded around a pin that once secured a torn cuff. A grocery list pierced at the corner where it had been pinned to a corkboard for 12 years. A whisper of graphite on the back of a receipt. Ask for the gray one, not the red. The pin was never sentimental, but it often witnessed sentiment. Hidden inside wedding dresses, christening gowns, and farewell suits. It did not carry the emotion, but it bore its tension. The human fabric, literal and figurative, is rarely neat, and the safety pin became its quiet negotiator. A clasp not just between fibers, but between moments. In the backstage regions of theater and film, pins remained constant companions. They fastened emergency alterations, secured microphone wires, anchored last-minute costumes. Crew members often carried them in mouth or sleeve, like tiny weapons against chaos. And when the curtain fell, the pins disappeared again removed, unbent, recoiled into pockets or prop drawers, the whisper of muslin parting like fog. More curiously, the safety pin began to appear in disciplines far removed from fabric. In electrical engineering, miniature variants helped mark test points. In forensic labs, stainless versions were used to secure evidence tags. In horticulture, gardeners used pins to train vines or secure plant ID cards. The object, it seemed, had no loyalty to context, only to the act of fastening. In education, teachers pinned together makeshift worksheets. Students repaired backpacks. Science fair projects depended on their quiet steadiness. One documented case tells of a classroom globe that split open during a demonstration on tectonic drift. A student repaired it with a safety pin and a rubber band. The globe held for 4 more years, the rustling of laminated maps under fingers. It would be a mistake to assume the safety pin was immune to obsolescence. In many quarters, it was quietly replaced by adhesive tabs, hook and loop fasteners, plastic snaps. These solutions, however, lacked a certain grace. They closed things. But they did not listen. A pin must be felt, tested, released with care. There is touch in its function, a human contract. Manufacturers responded not with redesigns, but with rebranding. Eco pins made of recycled steel. Child-safe pins with rounded guards, decorative packaging. But these gestures were largely superficial. The pin endured not because of novelty, but because of inertia. Like a melody that refuses to be modernized and therefore becomes eternal. Cultural references kept the pin flickering at the edges. Song lyrics. Collage art, satirical cartoons. In some subgenres of speculative fiction, safety pins became markers of the past emblems of a bygone world where objects were physical, fixable, fallible. They stood not for security, but for an age of small repairs. One science fiction short story featured a spacefarer who wore a pin on his uniform not for function, but for memory. It reminded him of Earth, of his mother's hands, of something staying shut. In the lower drawer of cabinet H, we keep one such pin, stainless steel, standard coil. It once traveled aboard a research vessel studying wave patterns in the Southern Ocean. The pin secured a torn strap on a notebook case. It held through storms, through frost, through cabin heat. And then, upon return, it was quietly retired. Cleaned, catalogued, and sent here. It still smells faintly of salt and oilskin. The whisper of canvas beneath cold fingers. In developing nations, safety pins remained essential, cheap, durable, portable. In field hospitals, in market stalls, in remote schools. They closed bags, fixed tents, aligned surgical dressings. In many places, a pen was the first line of resilience, not because it was best, but because it was present. Readily, humbly, quietly present. The muffled rattle of a metal tin in a worn canvas pouch. Even in spirituality, the pen found footholds. Certain folk traditions used it as a ward against bad luck, envy, or evil spirits. A pin clasped inside clothing point outward to reflect malice. Or 3 pins buried under a doorstep to preserve domestic harmony. These rituals, however unscientific, pointed again to the object's strange aura, the power not to shield but to hold. In grief, too, it found a role. In memorial ceremonies, black ribbons were often fastened by pins. Not knotted, not glued, not stitched. Pinned, so they might be removed or replaced or passed to another. The act of fastening something without finality. Mourning, too, is provisional. The whisper of silk drawn tight over a quiet chest. And so we arrive at the threshold of something peculiar, the safety pin as memory device, not digital, not archival, but tactile, spatial, provisional. It recalls not the event, but the adjustment. Not the story, but the moment in which something nearly failed and didn't. In the next room, we will follow the pin into metaphor. But for now, let us stand quietly before this wall of tiny clasps, each resting against soft felt. No longer needed, no longer sharp, still holding, still waiting. There is something oddly devotional about a safety pin. Not in the sense of ritual or belief, but in its quiet, repeated offering of function. Each time it is opened, curved, applied, and closed again, the gesture mimics a kind of minor liturgy. The same motion, the same care, the same small affirmation that things can, for a moment, be held together. Like a sigh rehearsed until it becomes prayer. In the central gallery, beneath a dome of filtered skylight, we house what may be the least interesting-looking exhibit in the entire museum, a simple wooden bowl filled with unused pins. They are standard size, nickel-plated, no inscription, no provenance. And yet, each one factory fresh trembles slightly with the possibility of sudden usefulness. There is an energy in readiness, the silent murmur of potential. From the 2010s onward, the safety pin occupied a strange duality. It was both everywhere and nowhere, available in stores, online, and drawers and dust, but rarely spoken of, rarely purchased deliberately. It arrived by default in sewing kits and hotel vanity sets. Its presence was assumed, its purpose diluted. Some regarded it as a relic, others as a minor necessity. Like a teaspoon in a drawer filled with machines, yet the stories accumulated. One pin held a passport photo inside a wallet through 4 changes of address. One closed the hospital gown of a patient too thin for buttons. One was used to pick a lock, badly. Another fastened a cape made from curtains, worn proudly by a child during a thunderstorm. The curtain tore, the pin held. The hush of damp velvet dragged across floorboards. As modern wardrobes shifted, the pin remained marginally relevant. Yoga pants did not need pins. Zippers did their work with mechanical certainty. But in costume shops, in weddings held outdoors, in theater schools and sewing classes, the safety pin was still passed from hand to hand, often borrowed, rarely returned, not out of selfishness, but forgetfulness. It disappears into the folds of life. In one peculiar campaign, a stationery company briefly attempted to relaunch the pen as a journaling accessory, gold-coated, bundled with pressed flowers and cursive labels. The attempt was sincere, but the pen resisted. It did not belong in flat lays or hashtags. It belonged in the small drawer beside the receipts, in the bottom of the tote bag, in the emergency kit duct-taped under the sink, the sound of fingernails tapping on aluminum. In the sphere of humanitarian aid, safety pins continued to perform without protest. Disaster relief packages included them. Midwives in conflict zones used them to fasten cloth when sutures were unavailable. They repaired mosquito nets, secured water pouches, held the temporary together long enough to become bearable, a clasped breath in a shattered place. One case study, stored in the museum's archive, documents a refugee camp where a single crate of safety pins was distributed among over 10,000 people. The pins found hundreds of uses fashioning makeshift shoes, repairing tents, attaching IDs. By the end of the year, fewer than 12 remained. Not because they failed, but because they were used until they vanished. Like chalk marks in the rain. The pin also wandered into the absurd. A magician once swallowed 15 safety pins on stage, only to pull them out again linked into a chain. An illusion, of course, but one that echoed the object's deeper nature. Connection rearranged. Danger hidden inside order. The murmured applause of velvet curtains parting. At the university level, design students began studying the safety pin not for reinvention, but for principle. Courses on product minimalism cited it as a near-perfect object, efficient, economic, elegant in its restraint. One thesis described it as a closed system of trust. Another, a loop that protects its own violence. These were not exaggerations, only different words for the same function. We also observed its entrance into philosophy softly through the back door. Essays appeared on the ethics of repair, the aesthetics of minimal intervention. The safety pin became emblematic of a worldview, that perfection is not necessary, only temporary cohesion. One philosopher compared it to a sentence that holds its meaning only long enough to be understood, then dissolves. The rustle of marginalia on a borrowed book. Even in humor, the safety pin kept its head low. It was the punchline to no joke. Its rarity and satire preserved its dignity. Comedians did not mock it. Writers rarely centered it. It was too humble to parody, too honest to romanticize. The pin persisted as itself, like an actor content with supporting roles, knowing that the story leans on the quiet. The museum's collection now includes over 3,000 individual pins, none remarkable on their own. And yet, when displayed together, they hum. Not literally, but conceptually, a murmur of timelines. Each clasped a problem, then moved on. Each entered a crisis and left behind no trace. Not because it failed, but because it succeeded exactly as long as needed. The whisper of cotton stretched too far. And so, as we conclude this phase of the journey, we arrive not at innovation or celebration, but at continuity. The safety pin remains not because it changes, but because it stays still while the world rushes past. It holds softly, without praise. Let us enter the realm of metaphors not declared, but inferred. For even the most practical object, when handled long enough, begins to absorb meaning. The safety pin, designed for cloth and clasp, became over time something stranger, a vessel for implication. Its form, unchanged, began to suggest things beyond function. Not loudly, not even clearly, but enough for poets and protesters to take notice. Like mist collecting on the lens of an overhead projector, we begin in silence. A safety pin clipped to a curtain. The curtain hangs in a hospital room. It covers nothing new. It has been there since the 1990s. The fabric is faded. The track above it squeaks faintly when drawn. The pin was placed there to secure a torn edge. But it has become part of the whole. No one remembers who applied it. No one removes it, like a scar on the architecture of care. By the 2020s, the pin's symbolic potential had expanded in every direction. Political artists used it as shorthand for fragility, protest, solidarity, defiance, but always provisionally. The pin never claimed permanence. It said softly, "I will hold this for now." And in a culture awash in declarations, the humility of that statement carried peculiar force. In literature, the object began to appear as a metaphor for memory, for unresolved connection, for stitched-over history. One novel described a mother's mind as fastened shut like a rusted pin liable to open, but only when twisted just wrong. Another poem compared forgiveness to a safety pin in an old coat, the kind you forget until it stings you. And still, the pin itself did not change. Manufacturers continue to produce it in quiet millions: coils, clasps, points, shields. Some arrived in recycled cardboard packaging with minimalist fonts, others in plastic tubs beside sequins and thimbles. All were alike. The sameness itself became part of the metaphor. That one thing, made again and again, could mean more each time. In education, the safety pin took on allegorical weight. Teachers used it to explain tension, balance, restraint. In classrooms exploring literature or ethics, a single pin might be passed around, examined as symbol. One philosophy instructor reportedly opened every semester by holding up a pin and saying, "This is what holds us together." He never explained further. The rustle of notebooks opening in unison. In music videos, the pin became visual punctuation clasped in lapels, floating in animation, turned slowly in slow motion. Its appearance suggested repair or danger or something missing. It offered no answers, only implication. Like a sentence trailing into ellipsis just before the truth. Fashion, ever oscillating between gesture and irony, reclaimed the pin once more. Haute couture garments arrived on runways bristling with oversized safety pins, each 5 inches long, each immaculately useless. Critics wrote essays, bloggers interpreted layers. But beneath the spectacle, the original pins still waited hidden in hems anchoring zippers, holding up straps, invisible, necessary, a whisper of wool brushing against lining. Meanwhile, in personal rituals, the pin endured. Some wore it secretly during exams as a charm. Others kept one in a wallet beside a faded photo. Not for safety, for grounding. A reminder of something small and holdable in a world that frayed constantly at the edges. The muffled rattle of coins and keys. In online forums and quiet corners of social media, users began to share safety pin stories. Tiny domestic crises resolved. Improvised victories. A bridesmaid's dress torn at the last moment, a key ring broken. A locket held shut. Each post ended the same way. I didn't think it would work. But it did. A class narrative, nothing profound. Yet read together, they formed something enduring. A chorus of temporary salvations. Even architects found metaphor in the object. A lecture on post-war housing once referred to emergency stairwells as urban safety pins, temporary structures that stayed forever. Elsewhere, a bridge engineer used the pin's clasp to explain distributed stress. The coil absorbs tension. The point protected, the whole system quiet. A whisper of load beneath concrete. Here in Gallery J, we display a small, unremarkable envelope. Inside, a single pin bronze, slightly corroded. It was found tucked into the spine of a diary owned by a lighthouse keeper. The diary contained weather reports, supply lists, a single haiku. The pin was never mentioned, and yet it stayed. Not as punctuation, as presence. And now we begin to see what was always there, that the safety pin, though designed for fabric, functions also as idea. Not fixed meaning, but held meaning. A way of delaying collapse. A refusal to abandon what could still be fastened, not indefinitely, but for now. The whisper of paper not yet torn. A metaphor once established does not rest, it seeps. Into language, into gesture, into the quiet places where tools become symbols. And the safety pin, with its simple loop and shielded point, had by now ceased to be merely a device. It had become a lens. A way of seeing the world not as fixed or broken, but as fastened. Temporarily. Gently. Just enough. Like a borrowed umbrella held together with tape and hope. This phase of its existence was marked out by transformation, but by diffusion. The pin appeared not just where it was needed, but where it was noticed. It no longer hid in fabric. It hovered on lapels and photographs, in the corners of paintings, and the closing shot of quiet films. And always it suggested something, that whatever was happening, however fragile, could still be held together, for now. Consider the museum's correspondence archive, a collection of over 400 postcards, each featuring a safety pin either described or affixed. One, written in a thin blue hand, reads, "Found this under the radiator. Still closed. Thought of you." Another, more cryptic, "You said I would break. But I had this. The card bears a rusted pin folded flat against dampened paper, the whisper of adhesive giving way. In literature, the safety pin's symbolic weight began to crystallize. It no longer floated, it anchored. Characters left pins as messages, pin notes to coats before vanishing. Use them to close wounds both literal and emotional. In one novel, a boy collects broken pins and keeps them in a jar, convinced they hold stories. In another, a woman wears one through the lining of her jacket, a quiet protest no one notices, not even her. The object's geometry became its message. The coil, patience. The clasp, care. The point, risk. The shield, restraint. Together, they formed a compact between damage and refusal, between danger and design, between opening and holding back, like a sentence that withholds its verb to preserve the silence. Cultural theorists, never once to resist a symbol, took interest. Essays emerged. Journals devoted special issues. The pin became shorthand for the provisional self, the curated identity, the tension between appearance and collapse. Some claimed it represented late capitalist coping. Others saw in it a kind of minimalist grace. None agreed. The pin made no effort to clarify. It merely clasped its silence a little tighter. In one university project, students were asked to wear a safety pin every day for a month. No explanation was given. The results varied. Some forgot. Some grew attached. Some experienced unexpected conversations. Is that for someone? Did something happen? Do you need help? One student reported feeling weirdly protected. Another confessed they stopped biting their nails, as if the pin merely present altered their posture. Theater picked up the thread. Stage directions began including safety pins, not as props but as signifiers. A woman straightens her collar and touches a hidden pin. A child gives one to a stranger. A man finds one in the pocket of a coat that doesn't belong to him. These moments never explain themselves. They don't need to. The pin speaks just loudly enough. In visual art, the pin became motif. Drawn, photographed, cast in bronze. One installation suspended hundreds of pins midair, each tied with transparent thread. They formed a shimmering cloud, motionless and trembling. Visitors walked beneath them and whispered. Another artist made a stop-motion animation of a single pin slowly uncoiling, then recoiling on repeat. It ran for 3 hours. No music, no sound. Just the whisper of movement imagined. In activist spaces, the pin's reappearance was cautious. After its brief political surge, many questioned its efficacy, and yet in the quiet corners it remained. On backpacks, on scarves, sometimes paired with other symbols. Sometimes alone, not a statement. A suggestion. A small signal in a loud room. A whisper of canvas brushing against thread. Here in display case 47, we keep what we call the unclassed archive. A selection of pins that were found open mid-use, mid-thought, mid-act. They are not broken. They are not fastened. They are between. One clasped the sleeve of a departing parent's coat, never closed. One rested on a desk beside a resignation letter. One pierced the envelope of a letter that was never sent. These objects do not declare. They defer. Language itself bent gently toward the object. The phrase safety pinned together began to appear in essays and op-eds. Not derogatory, descriptive. A city safety pinned together after a storm. A family safety pinned by obligation. A plan safety pinned by optimism and string. The phrase suggested something not fragile but responsive, not permanent but not broken either. And here lies the quiet genius of the object, its refusal to demand. Unlike a button, it does not ask for a hole. Unlike glue, it does not insist on fusion. It offers a clasp, a hinge, an option. Its use is always a choice, small, deliberate, patient. Like deciding not to interrupt someone, even though you disagree. In the museum's evening exhibit, only visible in low light, we show a wall of fabric panels, each repaired with a single pin. The tears are not hidden. The repairs are not elegant. But each one holds. Each one says, "This mattered enough to mend." Not well, not forever, but enough. The murmur of thread under tension. There comes a point in every object's life where its utility begins to dissolve not into disuse, but into abstraction. The safety pin, having long since completed its journey through invention, distribution, repetition, and symbolism, now enters this next phase, the soft blurring of meaning. It still fastens things, yes, but more often it fastens things that no longer need fastening just in case. Like locking a diary already empty. In this gallery, we observe the pin not in use, but in gesture. One is pressed into the fabric of a museum guide's lapel, not decorative, not functional, simply there. Another rests on the edge of a shelf in the gift shop beside bookmarks and hand cream. It has no label, no price tag. It's unclear if it belongs there at all. The hush of glass beneath hesitant fingers. This is the era of the safety pin as subconscious punctuation. It appears in places where closure is not required, but anticipated. A bookmark, a trouser pocket, the lining of a backpack. The object's presence becomes more about potential than purpose. It says, "I could be useful. I might be needed." I still remember how to hold. In one cafe in southern Wales, a wall of lost and found items includes 7 safety pins, each with a note found near table 4, bathroom floor, and cookie jar. They are pinned to the wall with other pins, a recursive act. Visitors stare, unsure whether the wall is intentional or accidental. It is neither, and both. Psychologically, the pin's loop has taken root. Therapists describe safety pin thoughts, small stabilizing ideas used to hold together larger, unraveling ones, not truths, not affirmations, just thoughts that keep things from falling apart. I have food in the fridge. The cat still purrs. Tomorrow exists. The coil becomes cognitive, a soft mental clasp. In storytelling, the safety pin has become structural. Filmmakers use it as visual anchor. A character fiddles with one during stress. Another passes one quietly during a funeral. The object, almost imperceptible, carries emotional gravity. It doesn't explain. It reminds of risk, of repair, of restraint. Like a thread sewn into a narrative just to keep it from slipping. Our collection includes the pin letter, a donation from a retired archivist. It's a personal letter never sent. Pinned shut but never sealed. The pin has left a small rust bloom on the paper. The letter reads, "I didn't know how to say this, but I wanted it held somehow. There is no signature." The envelope was found in a book on binding techniques. The hush of paper held too long. In quiet philosophical circles, the object has taken on an unexpected role, the anti-assertion. Not a symbol of solution, but of suspension, an argument that does not conclude. A question that fastens itself temporarily to certainty, then releases. The safety pin becomes a metaphor for patience and uncertainty. Not for fixing, but for waiting. For admitting one doesn't know and holding the space until one might. One speaker, addressing a conference on ethical design, held up a pen and said simply, "This is not the answer. This is how we carry the question." The room did not applaud. They simply nodded. The sound of wool sleeves crossing quietly over chest. Children still use them, though differently now. Not to fasten clothing, but as tools and games of imagination. A tiny sword. A latch for a treasure box, a hinge for folded cardboard wings. The point is dulled. The clasp is unsure. But the gesture remains, a belief in the closability of things. There are pins in museums other than this one. Often overlooked. Sometimes labeled miscellaneous metal clasp, occasionally misattributed. But they linger on tapestries, in textile drawers, in field kits used in polar expeditions. One was found on the collar of a taxidermy fox, placed there by a 19th century assistant to keep the fur flat. It remains. The fur has curled. The pin has not. And what of the digital world? There, too, the metaphor holds. We pin tabs in browsers. We pin posts to profiles. We pin locations on maps. Each act suggests permanence, but only offers priority. The pin holds until something else must be held. A hierarchy of attention, not of truth. A whisper of silicone under fingertips. It would be easy to declare the safety pin obsolete. It has not innovated. It has not scaled. It has not disrupted. But in its refusal to change, it has outlasted fashion. It does not shout. It does not blink. It does not ask to be plugged in. It simply waits to be called upon and then works. In the closing drawer of this gallery, we keep a simple display. 20 identical pins, side by side, unfastened. No labels, no years, no metadata, only shape, only stillness. Visitors often walk past without stopping. Some don't notice them at all. Others lean in and whisper to companions. Are they? All the same? They are not, but they do the same thing. They offer the same gesture, the same curl, the same hush. We have now entered the domain of the nearly imperceptible, where function no longer defines the object and symbolism no longer insists upon itself. The safety pin, that modest hinge of steel and spiral, now exists primarily in proximity to memory, to gesture, to thought. It does not act. It abides. Like a string tied around a finger long after the task has been forgotten. In this twilight phase, the pin no longer fastens things so much as it suggests the idea of fastening. One does not use it. One remembers that one could. It resides in pencil cases with no pencils and tins beside buttons whose matching garments are long gone. Its value lies not in action, but in implication. The whisper of threadless fabric folded with care. At the far end of the museum's west corridor, in a narrow alcove of blue velvet, rests a collection known as the Almost Used. Each pin here was selected for its evidence of hesitation, a bend in the coil, a scratch on the clasp, a smear of fabric dye. They were held in hand, considered, merely applied, but not. Each one represents a decision deferred, an action imagined, a repair never made. Why did the user stop? Perhaps the tear was too large. Perhaps the urgency passed. Perhaps the object being mended ceased to matter. These pins are not tools. They are pauses. Like commas misread as full stops. In poetry, the pin has reached a kind of linguistic saturation. It appears not just as image, but as structure. A poem may hinge at its midpoint like a pin opening, closing, curving inward. Titles now evoke it. Pinned between days, safety measures. The spiral. Not all poems are about the object. Few are. But its shape, its rhythm, its paradoxical gentleness and sharpness, these now dwell in metaphorical muscle. Language continues to mirror it. A troubled family is barely held together. A nervous speech is clasped in silence. A city recovering from unrest is looped in quiet tension. These are not cliches. They are echoes, resonances of an object that has never tried to be more than what it is, and in doing so, has become more than most things are. Children born into touchscreen ecosystems may never need a safety pin. Their clothes are elastic. Their shoes use Velcro. Their environments are zipped, tapped, scanned. And yet, when handed one, they instinctively grasp its function. Twist, pull, fasten. The gesture lives deeper than the instruction, like the sense of rhythm in someone who has never danced. In theater archives, directors have begun to use the safety pin not only on stage, but in rehearsal metaphors. Don't force the emotion, they say, just pin it in place. Meaning, hold it lightly, let it be provisional. Let it breathe. The safety pin becomes a mode of performance. Tension without strain, closure without finality. In the museum's library, one slim volume sits behind glass. The incomplete fastening, notes on the safety pin as thought form. The author, a retired philosopher and amateur tailor, proposes the pin as a model for thinking itself not linear, not recursive, but spiraled. Each thought loops back slightly before proceeding. The clasp holds just enough, the point always hidden. A whisper of paper cut too close to the fold. In grief, the safety pin has re-emerged in miniature rituals. In lieu of condolence cards, some leave pins tied to flowers, pinned to jackets, left on doorsteps. Note messages, markers, acknowledgments of something held, if only momentarily. One story tells of a mother who wore a pin on her sleeve for 40 days after her daughter's passing, then quietly unpinned it and placed it in a drawer. The drawer was never opened again. Elsewhere, in a monastery in northern France, a small pin is used to fasten a parchment ribbon to a prayer book. The ribbon contains no writing. The pin has dulled to a pewter softness. But still, each morning it is opened, moved one page forward, and closed again, the whisper of silence becoming rhythm. It would be tempting to call the pin timeless, but this would be inaccurate. It ages, it rusts, it weakens, it disappears. Its strength is not in defiance of time, but in gentleness within it. It survives not because it withstands pressure, but because it adapts to it. It bends without snapping. It clasps without locking, like a door held ajar by habit alone. And so we begin to encounter the pin not as object, nor metaphor, nor even memory, but as presence, a small curved stillness. A minor gravity in a world increasingly frictionless. It makes no noise. It requires no maintenance, but it reminds. And in reminding, it offers a strange kind of solace, that not everything need be reinvented. Some things simply wait to be useful again. We have now reached the threshold where the object begins to recede, not through abandonment nor disinterest, but through absorption. The safety pin, once a distinct thing of wire and coil, becomes less a tool than a shape memory. It survives not by being seen, but by being felt faintly, as one might feel the outline of a key long after the lock is gone. In this final triad of galleries, we trace not invention, not usage, but echo. The safety pin is no longer merely a thing. It is a trace of a thing, a residue in language, in behavior, in structure. Like the smell of iron on your fingers after touching an old door handle. Consider the collection titled Structural Ghosts. A series of abandoned garments, all missing the safety pins that once held them together, a hem slightly puckered, a waistband slack, a jacket pocket stitched shut where a pin once rested. No pin remains, but its absence is precise. You can see where it lived, the hush of pressed cotton holding its breath. Architects have begun to reference the pin in blueprints not visually, but conceptually. Emergency staircases that pin two structures together. Temporary housing units that loop into permanent frameworks. A proposal in Denmark for modular bridges describes their joints as coil tension linkages, a term borrowed directly from safety pin mechanics. The object, having left the building, now underpins the blueprint. In mathematics, the spiral has long been a metaphor, but now, the safety pin's geometry, the contained arc, the restrained return has entered topology lectures. A pin, after all, is a closed curve with one point hidden from view. It is a loop with teeth, a suggestion of infinity disguised as closure, the murmur of chalk dust settling after a diagram erased. In interpersonal relationships, therapists report a rise in what some call pin bonds, attachments formed not by longevity or intensity, but by sudden utility. A stranger who helps you in a crisis, a fleeting friend. A former lover who reappears briefly to hold together something you couldn't face alone. These bonds rarely last. But like the safety pin, their value lies not in permanence, but in timely tension. One visitor to the museum left a note in our guest book. I wore one through college, not for clothes, just for later. I never used it. But knowing it was there helped. The pin did nothing. And that was enough. In this wing, we display unclapped structures, photos of temporary installations, protest architecture, refugee tents, scaffolding that held until something better arrived. Each accompanied by a pin, not from the site, but offered an echo, not a relic. A rhyme, language too, has internalized the object. Sentences loop back on themselves. Arguments curve towards stillness rather than resolution. When a say begins, to clasp is not to close. It is to delay collapse. The phrase does not explain. It folds like a letter with no sender, the faint creak of folded paper read too many times. Even in grief rituals, the safety pin has found a quieter role. Some mourners now pin together the pages of condolence books. Others fasten small black ribbons with invisible pins not to display, but to feel. The clasp becomes a gesture not of mourning, but of holding sorrow in place just long enough to look at it, not forever, just until the next breath. In a short film titled Clasp, a woman finds a pin in her late father's coat pocket. She carries it in her wallet unopened through scenes of loss and quiet transformation. In the final shot, she uses it to fasten a torn seatbelt cover in a taxi. The camera lingers. Nothing is said. The point disappears into fabric. The clasp clicks. The film ends. And now, in digital space, the safety pin has become recursive. It appears in AI-generated art, in simulations, in procedural animations, not drawn, not photographed, calculated, described in code. An object that was once bent by hand is now invoked by syntax, and still its arc persists. The whisper of binary brushing against memory. The museum's final contribution in this hall is a box marked simply hands. It contains castings of people's fingers in the act of holding pins between thumb and forefinger or mid-clasp, or just after letting go. Each sculpture is hollow. Each shape is incomplete. The pin itself is missing. What remains is the gesture, the hesitation, the intent. And perhaps that is the final function of the safety pin, not to fasten fabric or suggest meaning, but to preserve gesture. To offer a form for a certain kind of movement, deliberate, gentle, brief. A motion that says, I will not fix this, but I will hold it steady while you do.
We now descend into the softest region of the museum, where objects begin to dematerialize, and what remains is a kind of conceptual weather. The safety pin, long since retired from practical relevance, no longer stands on display. It floats in meaning, like dust suspended in light, held not by gravity but by the absence of disturbance. Here in the Echo Archive, we keep no pins. Only references. Poems, gestures, glances, diagrams. What matters now is not the thing itself, but the shape it left behind in human thought. Like a spoon removed from a bowl of flour, leaving only the hollow curve of intention. The safety pin has become an ethics. Not a set of rules, but a posture. A way of holding. To pin something is to take responsibility without claiming ownership. It is to act without imprint. To clasp without conquering. There is a kind of moral patience in this, a restraint that says, I am here only to help things not fall apart, and then I will go. This is not heroic. This is not aesthetic. This is infrastructure of the soul. In political philosophy, the safety pin has emerged as metaphor for what theorists call transitional cohesion, structures that hold systems together not because they are ideal, but because they are available. A civil servant. A local repairman. A neighbor who babysits during crisis. These are safety pins of the civic order. The coil, the clasp, the invisibility. One urban planner, writing in a journal now defunct, proposed the pin city, a model of infrastructure based on temporary stabilizations rather than permanent fixtures. Bike lanes made of rope. Community centers in shipping containers. Classrooms in parked buses. The success of the system, he argued, lay not in its endurance, but in its capacity to be removed once something better appeared. This logic echoes across disciplines. In digital networks, soft links function like safety pins, bridging incompatible systems just long enough for transition. In psychology, certain coping mechanisms serve as emotional pins, not solutions, but breathable compartments for pain. The pin has become a figure for accommodation, for the gentle interim. A whisper of structure while the foundation still sets. At the back of the Echo Archive sits a rotating display of single sentences contributed anonymously. I held it together longer than I thought I could. She never noticed the pin, only that the dress stayed closed. It wasn't beautiful, but it held. He left, but the clasp remained. Each line is printed on translucent vellum. Each fades slightly at the edge. Each is affixed to the wall with nothing. They simply hover, magnetically suspended. As if the pin has receded into the sentence. Some curators resist this final phase. They argue for tangible artifacts, physical objects, visible proof. But the pin has outgrown the need for tangibility. Its presence now belongs to the grammar of care, to the architecture of pause, to the engineering of just enough, like a sentence that ends not with a period, but with a breath. In ritual studies, the safety pin is referenced as a threshold object, used only at the edges of things. Birth, departure, rehearsal, emergency, repair. Never during the middle. It does not belong in permanence. It belongs in transition, in the act of becoming not yet. A dancer in an experimental company choreographed a piece called Clasp. It lasted 12 minutes. No music. Only the sound of fabric being pulled, fastened, released. Each movement was anchored by an imagined pin. At the end, she stood still for 20 seconds, then made the gesture of removing something from her chest. Her hands were empty. The air seemed quieter than it had been before. In one linguistic study, researchers mapped metaphors of containment across languages. The safety pin, where it appeared, was never primary. Always support. Always provisional. Its role was to help describe other things. Not to be described. This is the final elegance of the pin. It does not seek centrality, and so it becomes universal. Even in silence, it speaks, of restraint, of sufficiency, of action that leaves no mark. And so we do not mourn its disappearance. We observe it. We trace its arc, its point, its refusal to insist. The safety pin does not dissolve. It simply becomes the thing you reach for in your mind when something breaks, and you whisper to yourself, I need, just something, to hold this.
This is the final corridor in which the safety pin remains materially intact. Beyond here, it will fade into principle, into metaphor, into the quiet air between gestures. But here, just before that vanishing, it still holds weight, still reflects light, still casts the faintest of shadows like a thought one nearly forgets, then catches again by the sleeve. The last century did not erase the safety pin. It simply made it optional, like handwriting, like silence. In our climate-controlled cabinet, Draw 1 3D, there are 144 safety pins, all manufactured between 2000 and 2030. They vary in finish nickel, copper, matte black, but not in form. Some were made by hand in workshops, others by machine in factories whose names are already forgotten. And yet, they are indistinguishable in function. That sameness, after so long, becomes a form of reverence. A hush of stainless steel wrapped in thin paper. Even now, new pins are made. Not many, not with flourish. They appear in sewing kits, emergency bundles, stagecraft bins. Retailers stock them out of habit more than demand. They sell in bulk. They arrive unannounced. No algorithm recommends them. No influencer reviews them. They are not retro. They are not ironic. They are merely there. In logistics chains, pins persist as unspoken redundancy. A warehouse label falls off. A form must be clipped. A sample must be fastened. A courier wraps a tag around a canvas bag and reaches, without thinking, for the only object that can do exactly what it does. Not permanently, not proudly, just adequately. Some designers have tried to innovate biodegradable pins. Magnetic clasps in pin form, app-connected emergency clips. These fail. Not because they don't work, but because they misunderstand. The safety pin does not compete, it compensates. It does not evolve, it endures. Like a paperweight on a stack of letters no one dares throw away. One recent example comes from an underground music venue in Helsinki. The backstage repair kit contains exactly one pair of scissors, one roll of black tape, and 3 safety pins. In 15 years, no performer has needed more. Torn costumes, slipping straps, loose cable covers. The pin appears, completes its task, and retreats, not with gratitude, with silence. In hospice care, nurses sometimes carry a single pin on their lanyards not for medical use, but for ritual. When a patient dies, they fasten the edge of the bedsheet with it. Just once, just long enough. It is a gesture without protocol. It does not appear in manuals, but it happens, again and again. A soft clasp between presence and absence. At weddings, the safety pin has become both panic and provision, a broken bustle. a misplaced hook. A moment of unraveling met with the calm fingers of someone who has quietly been prepared all along. Later, the pin is removed. No one sees. No one remembers. But the hem holds in every photo. The whisper of satin against polished floorboards. This is what the safety pin does best. It allows things to appear seamless by absorbing tension. It does not prevent failure. It delays it gently. It does not assert control. It offers containment. And it does so while asking nothing of attention. Like a stagehand behind the curtain, mouthing every line as it's spoken aloud. In humanitarian work, safety pins remain part of the standard field pack not because they're irreplaceable, but because nothing else combines durability, size, flexibility, and indifference to circumstance so well. A pin can rust, a pin can bend, but it will still fasten. It still closes, even in the rain. One doctor, now retired, wrote in his field notes, "The pin is not sterile, it is not precise. But it is there when the thread runs out." He included a sketch of a bandage held closed by a safety pin. No face, no patient. Just fabric, pressure, clasp, the soft click of compromise. In the final archival envelope of this haul lies a pin made yesterday. It is new. Its spring is tight. Its shine is impersonal. But beside it lies a note in faint pencil for whatever comes loose. There is no signature. Just the shape of the words, nearly erased by breath. A whisper of graphite on textured paper. And so ends the tangible history of the safety pin, not with invention, nor glory, nor decay, but with quiet persistence. It has not changed. It has been changed around. The world has moved and the pin remains, still clasped, still curved, still implied in every drawer that holds something for later.
Now we enter the airless room. The final gallery, where objects no longer rest behind glass but dissolve into language, into thought, into gesture half-remembered. The safety pin has fulfilled its material life. What remains now is resonance, a kind of soft pressure in the chest when something fragile threatens to fall apart, and one thinks, not yet. To clasp, at this point, is not to bind but to believe. That something can be held. That a form can be maintained just long enough for meaning to pass through it. The pin becomes not a solution, but a suspension. A delay between unraveling and repair. The hush between cause and collapse. You will not find it here. Not visibly. The pin no longer resides in drawers or pouches or toolkits. It resides in ways of thinking. In the softness with which we approach rupture. In the idea that not every wound requires stitching, not every failure needs fixing, not every closure must be sealed. Some need only to be held. Briefly. Lightly. With care. In this space, the safety pin is metaphor, yes, but also memory, pause, ethics, posture. It is the decision not to force, not to finalize, not to perfect. It is the hand that says, "I will not fix this forever, but I will keep it from falling right now, and that will be enough." The philosopher who left no name, whose notes we preserve in the echo vault, once wrote, "To clasp is to recognize fragility without fearing it. To coil is to resist straight lines. To shield the point is to acknowledge the danger within what helps." This was scribbled on the back of a museum program. Folded once. No pin attached. But the crease held. We live in a time that glorifies permanence. Completion. Security that does not budge. Yet the safety pin whispers the opposite, that truth is often provisional. That meaning is often mobile. That repair, to be honest, must not pretend to erase what was broken. Here, the pin suggests an ethic of sufficient closeness. Not the fusion of glue, not the authority of knots, but the respectful nearness of a clasp. It does not dominate. It negotiates. It adjusts. It asks quietly, "Is this enough for now?" The room is filled with the breath of those who have paused here. There are no labels. Only silhouettes. The curve of a question. The impression of something gently held. A whisper of linen drawn across a table. To speak of the pin is now to speak of moments. Not timelines. A breath held in the wings before stepping on stage. The silence after hearing bad news, before answering. The moment you hold your friend's gaze, not with advice, but with your presence. That, too, is a clasp. That, too, is a pin. In theology, we find analogues. The safety pin is liminal grace, not salvation, not revelation, but holding space between. The mercy of the middle. The act of standing in the doorway, neither entering nor leaving. The refusal to abandon what is unresolved. In design, the pin has become an anti-object. It stands now as critique of over-design, of the need to seal, to perfect, to erase all traces of mending. The pin says, the mend belongs to the form. The clasp is part of the history. The visible fix is the beauty. And in relationships, it becomes symbol not of attachment, but of adjustment. The friend you do not speak to for months, but whose presence remains soft and coiled. The ex-lover whose gift still works. The parent who never explained, but always showed up. These are safety pin connections. Not tight, but still holding. A curator once asked, why do we keep returning to this object? The answer is not in utility. Not anymore. We return because the pin reminds us how to live with the provisional. To endure the almost, the not quite, the just enough. To clasp gently what would otherwise fall apart completely. The air in this room is heavier. Not oppressive. Still. As though everything has been tucked in. Softly. For the night. There are no cases here. No labels. Only reflections.
This is the end. Not of the safety pin, for it never quite begins or ends, but of our observation of it. We have followed its curve from invention through ubiquity, from object to idea, from metal to memory. And now, at the outermost edge of its meaning, we find not a conclusion, but a stillness. There is no final revelation. No secret history. Only the quiet persistence of a gesture. A hand reaching for something to hold things in place, not forever, but for now. The world frays, and the clasp remains. In this last room of the museum, there are no objects. The lights are low, the walls unadorned. The silence is not empty, but full. You are meant to pause here, to stand among all that the safety pin has touched without needing to name it. At this distance, what remains is not the pin itself, but its ethic, a refusal of closure that pretends to be permanent, a gentleness in the face of urgency, an understanding that mending is not always repair, that sometimes it is merely the offer to stay close to something that might come undone. We live now in a time of broken lines, interruptions, sudden openings. A world held together by contingent connections, gestures, glances, chords, calls, whispered agreements that say, I will not let this fall not all the way. And in this, we see the pin again. Not literally, but in every act of small solidarity. Every temporary grace, it does not ask for praise. It does not insist on itself. But it is there in the overlooked work, the unthanked effort, the quiet maintenance that allows life to proceed as though it were seamless. We live among clasped things. And we forget they are clasped until they come undone. A clasp is not a closure. It is a kindness. It says, this is not finished, but it is enough. This may not hold forever, but it will hold tonight. The clasp is the breath between unraveling and restoration. The mercy of delay, the logic of staying. And now the final lights dim. In the hush, the pin becomes the breath held during grief, the pause before response, the space between what was and what might yet be. It is the answer that does not end the question, but gives it room to rest. The coil remains, the point hidden, the clasp silent. We return then to where we began. Welcome to the Museum of Boring Things. Here, ordinary objects rest beneath the dust of time, gently sheltered in the muted glow of forgotten meanings. Each piece is carefully catalogued. A subscription merely records your name in the guest book. Tonight's exhibit is the safety pin, shaped without flourish, born in shadow yet indispensable in daily life. A quiet relic of anonymous brilliance. Let your thoughts uncoil, your breath soften. Should sleep arrive before the story ends, consider it a quiet gift from the collection. Now let us open the glass case. And so the safety pin, once coiled and curious, clasped in urgency, dulled by repetition, sharpened by memory, rests again, soft in memory, flexible in meaning, always ready to begin anew.